I welcome you to this orientation session for Community and Technical College trustees. My name is Gary Johnstone. I'm with the Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board. My two bosses were up here earlier. I work in the same area as Susan Brown and in what we're now calling strategic planning and funding, was previously planning and accountability, but we went through a small reorganization at the coordinating board effective November 1st. So I don't have my new title on the card, but I'm Deputy Assistant Commissioner in Strategic Planning and Funding. We're going to have 4 presentation sessions today, and then we'll have a break between the second and third presentation. I went down the list of our presenters today, and I think we have over 200 years of higher education experience in the presenters that they'll be presenting for you today. So just about any situation or topic that you can think of occurring, they probably have experience with in their years of service. The presenters that we have are currently at what in the accountability group is called very large, medium, and small. So we have we cover all the types of organizations. We're going to have several financial topics covered this morning. The purpose of this session is to give you a broad understanding of the financial issues and budget issues for addressing that will come up in community colleges, and to give you an exposure to the best practices and tools for your use in your responsibilities. These sessions are presented for your benefit as an orientation to being a trustee at a community college or a technical college. So if you have questions, things you don't quite understand what is being said, please interrupt and ask for clarification or for them the information to be represented. We're going to have 4 sessions. We'll have a break, as I mentioned, between the second and third session. And the 4th session, which will be the one I'll be presenting, we will finish by noon. I want to start out this morning with an introduction. Just a second. Our first session, the presenters are Betty McCrohan and John F. Cowan. Betty is president of Wharton Junior College. She's been their president since 2001. Prior to that, she was the Executive Vice President for Administrative Services. Betty also has held positions at Houston Community College, Texas Education Agency, and Austin Independent School District, where she was an elementary teacher. Johnette is the president of McLennan Community College since February 2009. And prior to that service, she was also the CFO and Executive Vice President for Business Services at McLennan. Johnette has also served as an instructor at Baylor in higher education administration. And Johnette has an associate degree at Paris Junior College, earned her bachelor's degree at Louisiana College, and has a master's and doctorate from Texas A&M Commerce. So welcome with me our 2 first presenters.
We wanted to talk and just have a conversation with you about understanding the revenue mix. And our overall thing that we might tell you to start with is that the community colleges are very different in revenue, and TSTC is very different. TSTC is a state agency, and we'll talk about them a little bit as we go along. But in the community colleges, our fees are different, and you as local boards have an opportunity to set that. Our fees are one of the higher end of the state at $115 for tuition and fees. Our tax base is much lower. We're about 32nd. So as you look at your tuition and fees and you look at the sources, which we'll talk about a little bit, we have to know that we're just very different. And the thing that might work for my institution might be very different from Betty. And Betty will talk about this a little bit later, I think. But we get about 82% of our revenue from in-district, and I'll let Betty tell you a little bit about her. That means that I'm getting $115 for most of my students. And so some of the out-of-district fees are very different, some of the out-of-state are very different. And Texas is different than other states. Just like TSTC doesn't have property taxes, in other states, some don't have property taxes either. Some get to keep their tuition and fees and others don't. So we just want to share a little bit about what we've learned over the years, and I'm going to turn it over to Betty.
Before I go into this particular slide, I just want to compare a little bit for you so you'll understand. When you look at McLennan, and we'll address this a little bit further, and Wharton, you kind of see numbers in enrollments that look similar, but we are, as Johnette said, quite different. The majority of our students, last accounting was 79% of our students come from outside of our tax district. So you can see that each community college is unique in that respect, that they serve that cohort of students within that service area. And ours, for the most part, come from the urban areas to our college. So we're very dependent on that out-of-district rate. So you see our in-district rate is lower, our out-of-district rate is higher. So as we go through this, you'll see more comparison between the two institutions, and your institution is very unique as well. What we've presented now is just an overall flow of funds that affect community colleges in Texas. And you can see the economy is up there. This is an interesting look at things as they come in and out of your institution. The economy affects us dramatically. Usually when the economy is down, we're up in enrollment. Students have less money, though, at that same time, but they usually qualify more for the federal funds. And also you can see that the availability of government funds is dependent upon the economy as well. So we have state funds and local funds in that mix, and the state funds are the appropriations that we receive, and then the local funds are your taxes. And I always include in that, whether it's students or not, it's still local funds if it's tuition and fees coming from your students. The one thing that we haven't focused as much on in the past is the federal money. And about 34% of all of community college students in Texas are on the Pell. And that has changed dramatically. We're going to discuss that just a little bit more. But that enrollment in Pell has gone down, and it's impacting our institutions. If you had a chance to look at your institution's financial statements, you'll probably see that number has dramatically declined. And there are a number of reasons for that. We'll go into that further. But it does impact our ability to serve that group of students that we are so uniquely qualified to serve, these changes in Pell.
And one of the things that affects the number on Pell would be if you have a high poverty rate. It might surprise you that in Waco we have about a 30% poverty rate. So we have been really dramatically impacted with the Pell changing. A lot of the rules have changed, and you may want to go over that with your presidents. Things on you can't come unless you with ability to benefit, and the number of semesters you can complete, and all of those things affect your students. For us, we had about 58% a couple of years ago on Pell. We're down to 46%. Some of you may be 10 or 15%, so the changes in the Pell guidelines may not affect you as much as it might do us. And another thing about the loans that we'll talk about a little bit more is your rates for default can be something you have to look at very closely, because there can be some long-term consequences with that. And you can see with us, our enrollment and the financial aid has really, it's gone down, and it's gone down with the changes in the Pell, the verifications and the other things.
And at Wharton, we're similar in that respect, that we've had a decline in Pell, but we have less students that qualify. We don't have that high poverty rate. So more and more of our students, but what we're seeing is one thing that you might be hearing from your financial aid staff is that they're being bombarded with this new verification that's coming in. It's not new that you have to verify files when the federal government sends them back and says, we don't really agree, we think there might be something wrong in this input, then we have to go through steps to verify. But they're becoming more efficient at sending them back to us, and a lot of us have the same staffs, and we have to go in and verify. And that slows down the process for a lot of your students, to the point that we actually had students that did not get their processing done in time because it takes such a long turnaround with the federal government. John Ann has some figures, but we figure we lost around 300-something students that could not get their processing done in time.
And mine was about 600 students. There are a lot of semesters, they can't go as many semesters as they used to, is one thing with the Pell. Used to could go 18 semesters, then it's down to 12. So we had with the first change in Pell, we had 1,000 students that we couldn't admit who wanted to come. So the federal government dollars really impact us a lot more than we all thought they would in earlier years.
Now, I'm just going to talk just a little bit about the actual sources that most of us deal with, and that's tuition and fees. And you as a board have the right to set tuition fees. There's no limit set by the state of Texas, unlike some of our four-year colleagues. So you have the ability to do that, but while we do that, we have to remain competitive, and we have to understand that our students are so greatly impacted by this, particularly with an inability to qualify for Pell. Local taxes are also set by you, but there are limits on that. You have a cap of $1 from the state. I think it's 50 cents for maintenance and operations as well. But you can increase that. You have the right to do general obligation bonds. You have to have those voted through. But some of you in your creation had a cap set. Some of you didn't. So that you have to understand as a board member too. You can't just arbitrarily go out and increase it. We're also impacted by the fact that we can be rolled back at a certain rate, 8%, and you also have to have hearings and all of that you must go through to inform the public of what you're doing. So those are, and along with the state appropriations, of course, and that has kind of switched in a way because now tuition and fees have become a greater component of our revenue source, where state appropriations at one time were a greater amount. Most of us are getting around, I believe, 20%, above 20% a little bit on state appropriations. And we'll talk a little bit more about how that's done in the future. But those are the main sources. And you can see the one that you have the most control over and ability is tuition and fees. And so you're going to hear from us a little bit more about how that has increased over the period.
So you can see that for all colleges that it's declined from about 68% in 1980 to 24% in 2013. But the mix is very different. At my college, it's about 48% in tuition and fees because we have a higher one, and some of the rest of you do too. And then you might be, Collin is $39. So it kind of makes you feel kind of bad when you're looking at your students are paying 115, Collins are paying 39, but they have a lot larger tax base. So we have to just kind of look at what our sources are and what our tax bases are and how we teach. Some of you teach with a large percent of adjuncts and you don't have to pay benefits. So that helps too as you're looking at your revenues and your budgets. Some of us have about 70% of our classes taught by full-time faculty. So that's just an extra expense, and that's a decision that's made at your institution. This kind of shows where ours is right now with 48%, and the taxes have stayed relatively low at 25%. Our total budget is $52.4 million.
And when you look at Wharton, you can see that our taxes have remained pretty flat, and that's a commitment that our Board of Trustees made years ago, that we basically use our tax money for facilities. So each board may have made some commitments in the past. While they're not legislated that way, you may have made some local commitments that you have to keep. And we've pretty well stabilized as far as, right now, we're not increasing tuition and fees. You can see that we had to at one time. Although that is our only option for the future, to keep providing the same services. And as Johnette said, we're impacted greatly by the fact that we have a huge service area and a small tax base. So there are all of these extenuating circumstances that we'll talk a little bit more about as we go forward.
And there are other things that impact your revenue, such as exemptions. For us, it's about a little over $500,000 for Hazelwood veterans. And then it's about $400,000 because we exempt tuition and fees for dual credit if it's financial need. All over the state, you'll find that very different. Some colleges charge the whole amount, some do a reduced amount, some don't charge anything at all. So it's just another indication of how different we are.
This just shows you the relationship between enrollment growth and tuition and fee revenue, that cost is going up. And, you know, continually, as I said earlier, tuition and fee is the way that most colleges are having to address this. We're trying to keep them low, but you can see that it has increased. It has dipped a little bit over the past. But since 2000, it's gone up, enrollment has gone up 61%. And so one of the ways in addressing that and continuing the services is to increase your tuition and fees.
And many of us have experienced a decline in the past couple of years. In fall of 2014, of those reporting, 32 of 50 colleges were declining a little bit. So the fact that you are declining is not so unusual.
This slide shows you the average tuition and fees for this period of time, and you can see that most community colleges in this state, all except 4, have still maintained their tuition fees under $100. So I think we've done a really good job, although you see that it is escalating. And I think there's some significant variances between people, that what they charge for in-district and out-of-district, what's considered for in-district and out-of-district. So those are issues that we deal with as well. It depends on whether you're out there in isolation by yourself or you have a neighbor that's next door. You know, all of those you have to take into consideration. But we've tried to keep those low, and when you compare us to a 4-year institution, we're still the best bargain going. When you take into account the transportation, housing, and all that, we're still about $6,800 less than the lower cost 4-year institution. So while we are struggling to keep open access for our students, we still are a good bargain, I believe.
We had a large increase in our tuition in 2010, and to 2011, we built 2 parking garages, and so we had to add about $5 a semester hour. And we had a strategy at that point to replace some of the state dollars we were losing with local dollars. And so we have not increased tuition at all or fees since 2012, because we're not happy that it's as high as it is, but to do the things we want to do, and with the new success initiatives we all have, we haven't been able to lower it any. Another thing that we might look at, it's not actually on this slide, but you might watch the legislative session to see what happens on appraisal caps and those kind of things.
This is just a look at Wharton. We're similar. We have been able to lower some of ours just slightly, but you can see the increases as well. And again, we're very heavily dependent on out-of-district students as compared to McLennan, that is serving more of the in-district. They have their tax district more matches what they're serving. And there's several like Wharton out there that have huge out-of-district offerings.
Many of the smaller colleges and smaller communities, and you'll know if that's you, will go to larger urban areas, and that's where you find a lot of your student enrollment, and you did that, didn't you, Betty?
Yeah, we have done that. I think Kilgore is another real good example of that, where we're trying to provide service in areas, and unfortunately, at one time, it was more attractive because of state funding, and now that has declined. and there's no tax support in those areas. Okay, we're looking at each other.
Says
This
your
is,
name.
yeah, thank you, has my name beside it, and she's given it to me. So, tax revenue has pretty much remained stable, but what's happened is the valuations have gone up significantly over a period of time. Some of you are well aware of that if you've heard the protests at Central Appraisal District, or you're down there when people get their tax statements. So it's mainly that that's occurred as opposed to increasing the tax rate itself. Most people have pretty much stayed with, we stay with the effective tax rate, a lot of you do, so that you don't have to go through all those other processes, number one. But you feel that's a fair thing to your community because they actually are paying more taxes.
Well, and for us, we've been staying at what the current rate is, which means we generally have to have hearings. And so, you know, if you go over the effective rate, you do have to have public hearings about that.
And this one is just showing the increase in valuation on property. And again, if you've probably heard these protests, or if you have property, I'm sure you do in your district, you might be a part of that. I think these tax collectors and people appraising become very efficient. They seem to be at my house every time I add a new structure, so I know that they're looking for resources, and we know that it benefits our community, but that's where your increase has been.
And another thing we've had this year is with the power plant, some of you probably experienced that before, is they filed a lawsuit after we had set our tax rate. So we're gonna now have about $900,000 less this year because of the timing of that. So those are other things to watch out for.
We're going to get more because I didn't tell you, it's about the amount, average is about .145 per $100 evaluation for statewide. So it's pretty low. Some of you also have a debt levy, not just maintenance and operation, and those, you know, general obligation, you vote those through. So a number of you, that's included in some of your totals as well. You've been able to do those, and applaud those of you that have been able to get your facilities up to date.
I think there are like 29 or 30 of us who have a debt that our taxpayers are paying, and that's the way we got some really nice buildings. But kind of, that's the INS part. This kind of shows that ours is quite a bit more than Betty's. I guess that's the bottom line. But in 2015, we had 8 districts who really accounted for 74% of the total evaluation. And that would be Alamo, Austin, Collin, Dallas, Houston, Lone Star, San Jac, and Tarrant. So that's why a lot of the larger districts have a lot more money from taxes.
This is just another showing the maintenance operation, the tax levies. We're just comparing the two. We don't have much, we have no debt as recent debt. We have some old debt we're paying, but we're just usually maintenance and operation.
Well, and some of you have quite a bit. We raised $75 million to do some tax bonds. Some of you just recently, I don't know where Austin is, I think you just passed a tax bond, didn't you? So that a lot. How much money was y'all's? 385. Yeah, 385. So it's pretty neat.
Yeah.
And that's just the tax levy.
Yeah. And this just compares, if you look at these larger, these institutions have larger tax base. They're just able to pass on some savings because of the taxpayers paying in that area, and they're serving primarily most of the students that are in their district. So they're able to pass that on with some lower tuition and fee rates, so.
And then some have quite a bit more out of district. I think Austin, y'all's is pretty high out of district, isn't it? And ours is not that much more.
I think this one is just another way of looking at the relationship between those. There is a relationship between the enrollment as well, as you can see, but it's spread quite a bit. But you can see Lone Star, Dallas, Tarrant, Alamo, your heavier enrollments. Basically, those are the institutions that, because their cost is greater, they're getting more state appropriations as well. So a little bit more successful or able to spread those costs, so.
And then this is just showing the part-time faculty. I mentioned that a while ago. That has a impact on what you can do.
I think it's important to note, just I'm going to add on that one, that a number of smaller community colleges, particularly rural community colleges, don't have access. We would love to have more adjuncts, but not able to do that as much as you are in the urban areas where you've got other universities where they can go from one to the other. You can pull from the university student population as well. So that does impact us in the rural areas more, I think.
We only have about 10 more minutes.
Okay, I'm moving along.
Okay.
This just shows you the state revenue sources. Most of you may understand, you probably do understand where the sources are from the state, so I'm not going to go over that one. This is the budgeting cycle that we're fixing to go through. And I'm not going to go through each of these steps, but we submit a request, the Texas Association of Community Colleges do for community colleges. We also submit a separate sheet ourselves, as do all of the other agencies, and those go through and are worked with the Legislative Budget Board. And then if you look, let's go ahead and there are public hearings during this time. We could talk a day about this whole process, but we're not going to.
But you have it if you want to study it later.
Yeah, it's in your handout, so. Suffice to say that each side, the House and the Senate, come up with their own bill, and then those go through the processes within each, go to committees, and hopefully come to conference at that last stages. And that's who we really work with to try to get some of the strategies and goals that we want. Certainly more money, we're always trying to do that, but you're going to see us talk in a little bit here about how we actually changed the appropriation process and mechanism for community colleges for the first time in a number of years.
We've just given you a little history so that you can see that in the early days, there wasn't much money for community colleges, and once we added the urban colleges, the amount really increased a lot, but it was only about $50 FTSE. Those were in those days. And then we had the formula funding system for a very long time.
I think that started in 1973, and I started with community colleges in 1977. So it was right after that. And we thought that was the greatest thing since sliced bread, because we got a lot more money, number one. That was a big issue. So
we're going to talk about the new formula. And, well,
that's the movement from where we
Yeah,
were. And
right.
I would invite you to read this in your handout. It's very interesting. I thought I knew everything about how this process had moved forward, but I didn't. There were some things that I really didn't remember or know. Might have been before my time.
this is the new formula.
Yeah, this is, I think, a tremendous step that we've taken as community colleges, because we really fought for this. It wasn't something that was mandated for us to do. So I applaud my colleagues and their commitment. This was the small institutions, the medium-sized, and the large institutions. And what is interesting to me is that you'll see that there was $50 million set aside for core operations, where we used to have small institutions supplement, and no one really knew what that was. We got it one year. The real small colleges didn't get it. The formula was just really very strange. So we all agreed, the big colleges, the small colleges, that each institution would receive $1 million. And that's taken off the top when the state decides how much they're going to fund. And then we have a new process where it's looking at student success points. It's an accountability system, and we believe strongly in student success, so we said, why are we not looking at that within our formula itself and helping those colleges and showing everyone that we care. So we pulled off 10%, and you can see that, how that's working. And that was $172 million. And then the majority of the funding still is going based upon the formula mechanism. We'll talk a little bit more about those accountability of student success points.
I'm just going past that.
Okay. Yeah, let's go past.
And that's just kind of the information about the specifics about what the success points are.
And it's a continuum process where a student goes through, and we get points for that, so you can read further about that. You want to talk?
Yeah, what, you want to go? I've got 5 minutes.
We're going to move through some of these quickly.
There's a 3-year average, and probably be better to read it later. And this shows what the weighted,
I think the important thing on the student success points is that we're going to compete against ourselves. That was a really critical point to us, that we see ourselves progressing and that we're accountable for that progression. We're not out there in the big pool with every other institution, but it's what are we doing to help students succeed, and that we can use that in our strategic planning and other things to make our institution better. And so we fought for that, and that is in the statute for the upcoming review and continuing process with this.
and that just shows you what's been happening on the base year contact hours. And contact hours are really basically the amount of time each faculty member stays in class with all the students. So if they have a 3-hour English course, that'd be 16 weeks, that'd be 48 contact hours. And then there's a different formula that some courses cost more to offer than others. And and that's basically. And then the group health insurance has changed a lot over time. The basic thing for you to know is in the last session, we negotiated with a Senate work team for 50%, which is a sad thing, except those are for those who are eligible. We had hoped that we could negotiate for 80%, and when we got in the negotiations, the senators were talking about 15%. So we were kind of sad to have to do that, but that's it's been different over the years. Sometimes we've had benefits and sometimes we haven't.
I think it's important to note, though, that we hope we've done away with this question of proportionality, which we used to fight over, and some of you are very aware of that. Trustees may not understand that as much, but that was really a bone of contention with some members of the legislature and us. So we've moved past that. We hope that will continue. I'll just move on past that.
You'll just move past that. We are required to participate in the state system. Some of you will remember we weren't always in the state system, and that's the 50% cost. TSDC, they're not under those same guidelines that we are.
I think we need to also realize, you may not, if you're not part of this, some institutions are paying Social Security. They also have some additional benefits that they give employees. So Social Security is a tremendous cost to those institutions that remain. It still is a great benefit, though, to those long-term employees that have been there. And you only had one option, I don't remember what year that was, to opt out of Social Security. And at Wharton, we decided not to opt out. Some of you may. So if you don't see that as a trustee in your cost, that's why.
We don't have Social Security in our institution. Then there's TSTC, Mike, with their new return value funding. It's going to be very interesting for y'all to go through that, I know. It's a total performance-based system. Anything in particular you'd want to say about that?
Early signs are it's going to do well for us.
Huh.
It's changed the focus of everything.
But it'd be something interesting to look at, and that's kind of something I got from y'all about the different parts of it. So, conclusions. You want to?
No,
The main thing to remember are our sources of funds. It's different. Remember, TSTC is a state agency, and the community colleges are political subdivisions. So for us, we have tuition, taxes, and state appropriations. For them, and they have a new funding model too, they don't have local taxes, but they do have tuition and state appropriations.
It's important to note that state appropriations, I think, you take away from this or have declined. If you look back historically, and this is the thing that I learned that I didn't realize, we're kind of going back to what we used to receive from the state, and it was a supplement, and that's the way we've moved. I don't see that changing for the future. So I think looking at staying competitive, keeping the cost down is going to be an important thing for us with tuition and fees. And of course, taxes, you need to be aware of what's, as Johnette just said, legislation coming up that might limit your ability to increase those taxes where you need to. That local control, I think, is a critical issue for you as trustees to look and make sure that you're able to do that and you can make those decisions for your own district. So I would just say those are two things that I would highlight in here.
Does anyone have a question?
Our out-of-district, I believe in here, it's 133 per semester hour. It's quoted in your information, and we still have to be careful about what we charge because we right up against other institutions as well.
And the second question I have is, you said that what credit is based on financial, the subsidy is based on financial. How do you determine that?
Well, and again, there are 50 different ways dual credit happens. And I've been looking at early college, and that happens about 50 ways too. But for us, we're now using free and reduced lunch. So we really are subsidizing that a good bit. But some of you are charging, then it gets very tricky if you're not charging and somebody else is, and somebody wants to come into your district because they're not charging, or UT Permian Basin comes in and takes it away. They don't have to follow the same rules we do, so it gets very complicated. That's what we're using, is the,
Yeah, not all colleges do that. We charge, for in-district now, we have cut our cost, but for out-of-district, we charge the same fee. And not every institution does that, so. It's the same, for out-of-district it is. For in-district, it's just the fees that they pay. They don't pay the $88 in tuition anymore.
any other questions? Me? Right.
Yes, I'm sorry, we did not mention that, and it does. It's a 50% on each of those. So some of you are picking up additional costs in that area. Yes, thank you, Mimi. That, we did not point that out, and that is a huge impact on a lot of institutions. We would have loved to have gotten more, and that, we are the only segment of higher education that actually is dealing with that low a percentage.
And there's also one thing, and I don't know if Ben will, if they will talk about it, is there was a rider that got added late, that if your enrollment declines, then we're going to have a penalty against our appropriation this coming year. So you may look for that too, if your enrollment declines.
You can appeal that, but we're not certain of how that's going to be reviewed at this point in time. Yeah.
Lots of good news from funding.
Yeah.
Any other questions? Okay, thank you.
Thank y'all for the opportunity.